Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well. I can't believe it, but we are entering yet another week, second week on what is probably my favorite module. It's either that or the next one, creativity. But I really love studying this module on the invisible gifted because I like to see how dedicated you guys are about advocating for these students. And it's one of my biggest passions in education is to help other teachers recognize the importance of seeing students' gifts and talents and how they may manifest in a different manner, depending upon their cultural background, depending upon their social economic background. Um, I'm just a really big proponent of entering the classroom through a dynamic mindset. So I'm glad to see you guys digging into this discussion post, and I'm looking forward to this coming week, some more complexity and kind of really considering what is it like to be these students who really need gifted services but they're not receiving them. Before I jump further into the invisible gifted, though, I wanted to rewind just a little bit and recap a couple of things that you guys wrote about in your critiques of your gifted education programs. I think it's important that you hear some of the similarities and differences that your classmates mentioned. So I thought I would take just a couple of minutes to recap. The biggest thing, and excuse me as I'm looking at my notes, but the biggest thing that you all mentioned over and over again was a lack of transparency. So a lot of you wrote, I've been looking on the website and I can't figure out what giftedness even is in my program. And I've written this individual, but they haven't gotten back to me yet. And this tab on the website doesn't work. And I can't really figure out what services are actually provided. It says one thing, but then when I talk to the teachers, it tells me another thing. So pretty much everyone in terms of areas for improvement in your gifted education programs mentioned improving some form of communication between other teachers and the gifted teacher, or the community and the administrators, particularly the parents as well. And that is a common problem across gifted ed. It becomes very decentralized and we're not sure what's really happening. In terms of communication, it's so important, especially if we are working with more of an enrichment type service. As we've studied, usually acceleration has been shown to be more effective by the research. That's not to say that enrichment doesn't have a good place in terms of gifted education services, but enrichment is really tricky. It has to be done correctly in order to be positive. So when we think about enrichment, the key is tying it to the academic content that the student is already working through in the regular education classroom. So if we have students pulled out, and a lot of the modules, or models rather, that you mentioned were pull-out models. If you just think about being a child and for 2 hours a week you're pulled out doing a very different curriculum than what you're learning in the classroom, you're going to have trouble making any kind of connection between your gifted education services and your regular education services. And what happens because of that is students consider this is my only gifted ed time. So it becomes really secluded. And when enrichment is just kind of random, it can become a problem. So a lot of you mentioned enrichment, which could be effective. But then a lot of you also mentioned that in conversations with other teachers or even the students themselves, you weren't actually sure what was happening in those enrichment classes. So think about improving that communication between the gifted teacher and the regular education teacher. How much more could be done if you could bring up in the regular education classroom something that was studied in the gifted classroom, or vice versa, to help those students make connections. Making connections is super important, as we know, in all education, but also in gifted ed, because we don't want our gifted students to think, oh, well, I'm only gifted during this pull-out time, and I don't need to think about transferring those skills to another setting. Overwhelmingly, that was the biggest piece of improvement that I heard from pretty much all of you. The majority of the programs that you analyzed were using the identification services as proposed in the South Carolina manual, which does not surprise me. So looking at those 3 dimensions from a norm-referenced aptitude test, achievement test, and then looking at that academic performance, whether it's a GPA or through what we call Project STAR. A couple of really interesting things I wanted to point out. Kimberly talked about this Brain Booster program that all of the second graders completed that was meant to prepare students to think critically, to do well on standardized tests, and to kind of just boost their brain. I like that a lot because it's available to all students. And if you remember, in gifted education in South Carolina, universal screening happens in second grade. So that is a very strategic decision upon, or I guess from the district's perspective, or maybe just the schools. So that Brain Booster program is important because it's available to all students. That would also be really helpful for gifted students in the classroom to recognize, oh, we're doing this in the regular education classroom, and then if they're formally identified later, we're going to be digging further into these skills. I also noticed that those of you who found definitions of gifted education or of giftedness recognize that the definition of giftedness usually did not align to the identification procedures or to the services provided. So a lot of the definitions that you reported mentioned things like artistic ability, which is great. In fact, that was some of the strengths that you guys discussed in your write-up, but it kind of fell off after that. So we're defining giftedness as an artistic ability, but then we're identifying giftedness on aptitude, achievement, and academic performance. So artistic ability kind of disappears. And then even bigger of a problem is in the services that we're providing, you're not finding a lot of evidence for serving the artistically gifted. So that lack of alignment is very common. Again, I think it can be brought back to a lack of communication. Several of you did mention some summer programs that are geared toward the arts. I think it's the ST Arts. People just call it STARTS in my experience, at least. That Winthrop actually offers is a good program that is geared toward artistic enrichment during the summer. I actually posted a lot of responses to you all. I don't know how they identify for that. I've done some digging, and I actually have some colleagues who have worked for that program, but I'm not sure how they identify which students are able to participate. I'm also not sure of the cost of that. So now that we're looking into the invisible gifted, think about the cost of some of these extracurricular things that are happening. Do all students have the same type of opportunities? One of you actually mentioned that there was an extra cost for AP classes, an extra cost to be in these gifted classes, which again, underrepresentation. If you come from a lower socioeconomic background, are you going to have the funds to be able to put your student in these classes? So there's so many things wrong, right? I also thought it was interesting, some of your definitions mention things like civic engagement, things like creativity, things like critical thinking, but then that was not carried over into identification and may be carried over into services. There are ways to measure creativity. There are ways to measure leadership potential, motivation. We'll look at next week when we start the module on creativity, we'll look at a measure of creative potential called the Torrance Test for Creative Potential, TTCT for short. In Georgia, that is often used for gifted identification. And a lot of times students who don't get in for aptitude or achievement test scores are likely to get in on that test of creative potential. There are also some mechanisms that work for motivation. I've seen portfolios used quite often, and having the students actually present the portfolios to a committee. So it would be interesting, maybe in some spare time, look at how other states serve the gifted. You'll be surprised by how much things change from one location to the next. So it's important to recognize that South Carolina's definition of giftedness is, of course, going to be different than Georgia's definition, than Nebraska's definition. And because of that, if students are moving, it's going to cause some problems. So I just wanted to say good job on those critiques. I wrote some pretty, not extensive, but some more detailed feedback than usual. I posed a lot of questions, mainly out of curiosity, mainly to encourage you to keep digging into these resources and keep asking your principals and the gifted teacher, what is this like? A lot of you reflected and said, it seems like we are very identification heavy, so we're into how can we identify students for these services, but then we're not really quite sure what the services are. So again, if I had to choose one word to summarize your findings, I would say transparency, or rather a lack of transparency. So it's really unclear what is actually being done for the gifted. Several of you had really good suggestions for how to practically solve this by improving the website, by having question and answer sessions, by bringing the parents and the community in and having their input. Several of you mentioned having the students' input in terms of what would be best for gifted education. So thank you for taking that assignment seriously. I think it's one of the more practical assignments that we do in this class because it helps you see the strengths and the areas of improvement where you actually are. And as I said in last week's video, it's a little overwhelming at times. It's easy to think I have too many things going on. How in the world can I make a positive difference? And I don't want you to leave this class feeling discouraged. I want you to leave this class feeling motivated to make a difference, even if it's as small as posting your flyer on the outside of your door that says, this is why gifted education is important. That small difference is going to trickle down. And as we saw in this module case study on the invisible gifted, the perspectives of individuals in terms of gifted education have a really great impact on our students. So there's your recap on gifted education programs within your unique environments. If you have questions or follow-up comments on what I wrote, please feel free to email me. And of course, I enjoy engaging in those conversations. Several of you have some unique situations, so I'd be happy to continue talking to you about that. Before we move on to the invisible gifted, I'm actually going to move my computer and plug it in, but I don't want to turn off this video, so bear with me for 1 minute. A little tour of my home. Okay, now you're totally paying attention because you're getting a full tour at the same time. So we talked about what does it mean to be gifted. We've talked about various characteristics that could provide a hint that a student is gifted. You've seen this week that those characteristics do not always look nice. They don't always look like the students we would want in our classroom. We have started to dig into the unique context of our own schools. And I just want to encourage you to keep going back to what does this look like in my own cultural context? What does this look like on Monday morning when I walk into the school or my child walks into the school? Because as you can see from this module on the invisible gifted, it's really important that we recognize that giftedness does not always look the same. So let's talk just for a minute about this term, the invisible gifted. And I said this last week in my introduction. That's actually just a term that I like to use because I think it's more of an umbrella term to mention the fact that we have a lot of underrepresentation of gifted students. One of you, yes, it was Pam. Actually, I recognize that in this infographic on underrepresentation, Native American students weren't even included. And that provoked me to do a little bit of research, and I posted an article in her discussion board. So I was happy to see her looking into that and thinking about, okay, are we including all of these students in this conversation about what it means to be an individual who may be gifted and is just not being recognized? So as most of my cases are, this case study is from a personal experience. When I was working in my doctorate at the University of Georgia, I worked with a Title I school, on a research team, as well as with some undergrads who were doing some field work in education. And when we first approached the principal, I wasn't actually there. When my colleagues had the first conversation, the principal actually said, "Well, we don't really have gifted students here." Um, at that time, there were 0 students in the entire school. The entire school identified as gifted. And being individuals in the field of gifted education, we knew that was a problem. So we knew we needed to do something. And my first experience was anger. And hopefully some of you felt the same way of like, this is ridiculous. Of course there's gifted students. Look at all these kids. Surely we have at least one gifted child in this whole school. But anger doesn't get you very far. And I was happy to see that the majority of you suggested, okay, we need to start by giving some research. We need to start by giving some real facts about underrepresentation, some real facts about how giftedness manifests differently depending upon their cultural context. So I was happy to see that although you expressed some frustration, when we talked about practical next steps for Jasmine, several of you mentioned, okay, we need to start with some research. We need to start with some debunking of myths and make sure that we hit this principle with some facts that cannot be ignored. So Allison started off by saying, let's figure out more about this student population. What are some of the characteristics that they may be showing, and how may they manifest in this unique cultural environment? So I was encouraged that Allison started with this perspective of let's figure out who these students are and then take on this problem from a very student-centered perspective. A lot of you mentioned the importance of professional development. So Drew mentioned the fact that we have students who are most likely gifted, but maybe they are underachieving, maybe they're afraid to get started with work because of perfectionism, and suggested to do some professional development around giftedness and how it may manifest in different environments. If you'll remember from earlier this semester when we've talked about gifted education in South Carolina, we only have that one chance for universal screening. So in grade 2, all students are screened for identification into a gifted education program. But from grades 3 to 11, you have to have a referral. Those referrals can come from the administrator, from the teacher, from the parent, also from the student themselves. But more often than not, in order to get into gifted education services, teachers are going to have to refer you to be screened. And if we have a perspective of we don't have gifted students here, then the teacher's not going to refer these students to be screened for gifted services. It's extra work for them. That's how they may see it. And many of you mentioned, want to give credit. Yes, Kayla mentioned the attitude and the expectations of the principal are going to trickle down into the classroom. So if the principal is constantly looking for problems, constantly looking for what gap can I close, where can I get everyone on the same even playing field, then that mindset is going to trickle down into the classroom. And the teachers are just looking for the problems, looking for who they can bring up and equalize. And because of that, we have this excellence gap forming. So we have the fact that students are not being appropriately identified for gifted education services. So again, the importance of mindset. Universal screening, only 1 year. As many of you mentioned, giftedness is developed. Giftedness changes. It's not this static trait. So we have to constantly be looking for indicators of giftedness. And without the appropriate professional development, as several of you mentioned, then teachers are simply not going to refer students for gifted services. So that is definitely a problem. I was encouraged, Christy actually shared a personal situation where she worked in a school environment and only 6 students were identified as gifted. When she approached the principal to do some ability grouping, the response was, well, we only have 6 students, it's not worth it. And oftentimes when we think about gifted education, we only think about how it's going to impact the students who are formally gifted. But as we have studied, and as Christy mentioned in her post, gifted education should be a continuum, and if appropriately conducted, it should be helping all students. So if gifted education is a continuum that involves differentiation within the classroom, and then those extracurricular services, and then those ability groups, and then maybe more formal things like a pull-out, all of those students, whether formally identified or not, should be at some point really benefiting from those gifted services. So I was happy to see Christy reflect that, wait, this wouldn't just help these 6 students, it would actually help the entire school. A couple of other things. Elizabeth did a good job mentioning the environmental factors. So when we think about giftedness, we've talked about we need the appropriate environment for those gifts to manifest. There is a lot of disparity, especially in younger students, with a lower income versus a higher income background. Think about what those students are doing on the weekends. Do they have the monetary resources to visit museums, to go to the zoo, to do things that stimulate their brain as much as more affluent individuals? So we have to think that in education, in the kindergarten, the first grade, the second grade classroom, and furthermore, the other class levels, we need to be promoting those environments so that giftedness can manifest. So I was happy to see many of you mention the fact that, okay, we probably have gifted students, they just have not had the opportunity to develop that giftedness. One of you said, Melina, I thought this was a really good clarification. It's not that they don't have gifted students at the school, it's that these students have not been identified. And I think that's a really important caveat. Just because they don't have that one test score doesn't mean that they're not gifted. And several of you mentioned the importance of using multiple criteria when we think about gifted education, not just depending upon aptitude or achievement, but looking at other traits, aptitudes, and behaviors as we see in this TABS referral form. A couple of other things. Davis had a good point in terms of universal screening, also thinking about taking cultural differences or language differences into account. Think about an English language learner. And we think about the validity of a test. Am I really measuring that student's aptitude, or am I measuring that student's ability to comprehend a language that is their second or third or even fourth language? So I thought that was a very good suggestion. Again, thinking back on those environmental factors. And I just really appreciated this constant discussion of the importance of mindset, the importance of attitude. You would be surprised. There's so much research out there about the expectation of the teachers and how that is going to directly impact how the students are behaving in the classroom. If the teacher thinks that a child can succeed, they will challenge them and they will create the appropriate environment for that child to succeed. And if we have an administrator who is saying, we don't have gifted kids, then that attitude is going to trickle down into the classroom and have a very negative effect. So I think that you guys did a good job really digging into this. A couple things just to recap. The first thing that most of you said was to provide professional development, and I think that is essential. So professional development, not just for the administrator, but also for the teachers themselves. Several of you mentioned beyond professional development, using other identification measures, so not just using test scores. There are states that use the FTAP, which is the measure that we looked at this week, or at least have some kind of behavioral scale. It does bother me in South Carolina that we don't use any checklist or observation scale. As we have seen, a lot of these traits and aptitudes and behaviors don't necessarily manifest as a high test score. That's just the fact of the matter. So that is a personal grievance of mine. If I look at gifted education in South Carolina, I do think it's quite important that we bring some more expectations. Beyond that, So starting with professional development, debunking some of those myths, and then going into maybe increasing our identification procedures, making sure that we have appropriate collaboration between gifted teachers and regular education teachers. As I've seen in the field and in your gifted education program critiques, a lot of times gifted teachers are spread across different schools or a whole district. So of course communication is difficult. So we want to think about practical methods for that communication to be able to occur. A couple of other things I wanted to mention. Lexi had a really good point about parents advocating for their children. And I wanted to dig into this one a little bit because I have seen examples of, okay, this child clearly needs gifted education services. They're not really getting through in terms of the standardized test scores, but they have a parent who gets it. And they have a parent who's really going to advocate for them. And that parent, through advocating and through making those meetings with the principal and making those meetings with the teacher, that parent can make a difference. And it really bothers me when students don't always have parents who understand what giftedness means, and it's no fault of their own. Imagine coming to this country from another country there we speak a different language, where the cultural context of education is very different. And a lot of other countries, anytime we put a label on students like gifted, it's a bad thing. So I've actually had teachers say, no, I've had parents opt out of gifted education testing because we don't want our students to be labeled as anything. Or imagine the family that the parents truly, truly care about the child, but you have a single mom with 4 kids who's working several jobs to get the students through school. And it bothers me that because of different socioeconomic differences, some parents have more of the capability to advocate for others. And it's important that we don't interpret a lack of, I want to say this really well because it really bothers me. I don't want you to think that just because the parent isn't advocating doesn't mean they don't care. There are so many other reasons for this lack of, quote, concern, because they could be working another job. They could have some kind of safety issues going on. They could be new to this country and not understand the process. So I'm really thankful that Lexi pointed out the importance of parents advocating for their students and the power of that. And I think as teachers, it's important that as we get to know our parents or the parents of our students, that we create that safe environment and that we communicate well with them, because we can help them advocate when they may not understand. Clearly, this is a soapbox issue of mine because I am just so bothered because we have so many students out there who would clearly benefit from gifted services. And I just appreciate seeing you guys step up and say something has to be done about this. Just a personal report on how my gifted research team approached the problem. So the Title I school we were working at did not trust us. They did not want to work with a university. They felt that a lot of times university professors would come in and do their research, get their data, and leave, which is unfortunately true in some situations. So we did a lot of relationship building. We did a lot of community outreach. We did a lot of making our faces known. I don't want to give myself a lot of credit because I was a little bit on the outskirt of this project, but I had colleagues who were there in the schools simply volunteering. So we built trust. That was the first step. The students started to know our faces. The teachers started to know our faces. The administrators started to know our faces. We volunteered at the school carnival. They had a creativity fiesta one night, and we hosted a table. We weren't collecting data. We weren't doing, quote, anything. But what we were doing is building a relationship. And that was really the first step to any change. Then we started bringing undergraduate students into their school simply to observe and to help. So we had students there who were helping in various classrooms, helping on the field, like the actual playground, just doing whatever we were asked to do. Gradually, as we built trust, we started doing some what we called enrichment classes. So we taught classes to all of the students, so like all of the kindergartners, all of the first graders, all of the second graders. And as we taught the classes, we gave the teachers observation forms to start to look for these characteristics of giftedness. And as we had the students working in small groups, they started to see that bossy kid was really just trying to be a good leader. They started to see that kid who would never shut up was really just super curious. So it's interesting because we were able to create that appropriate learning environment for those gifts to manifest. And then because we had built that relationship with the teachers, they were able to sit back in their classrooms and look at an observation sheet and then start to recognize, oh, wait, I might have a gifted kid. This kid who has been driving me nuts, maybe it's because he's really smart. Maybe it's because he requires some differentiated services. But this was a several years commitment. And I just wanted to point that out because when we do these critiques of the gifted education programs, it feels like, well, it's impossible to fix. And it's a slow process, but it's really a perceptual change. It's a mindset change. So what started as a conversation with the principal who said, I don't want anything to do with this, led to us volunteering, led to us helping a little bit more, then doing this example classes, and then the teachers had this light bulb moment of, oh my goodness, I think we have some students who are gifted in our courses. We still have connections to that school. I'm no longer at the University of Georgia, so I'm not working personally with them, but I know that their work has now trickled to other schools in the districts, and they have way more than 0 students identify for gifted services. But it's important to show that just because we have more gifted students identified, that's not how I'm going to describe the success of that endeavor. What is truly a success is now we've started to change the mindset of the administrators and started to change the mindset of the teachers themselves. So they're looking for assets, they're looking for strengths in the classroom, and they're looking for ways to serve those strengths. And remember, teachers are the gatekeepers to gifted ed. 3rd through 11th grade, if you want to get into gifted education, you need a referral. More often than not, that referral is going to come from the gifted education teacher. So great job on your discussion posts. I'll have those graded. I should be fully up to date now with grading. So if you're missing a grade for something besides this invisible gifted discussion post, then please let me know. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about your assignment for this week. This is a little bit more of a creative assignment than some of the others, which is fitting because next week we'll start looking into creativity. But for this assignment, your challenge is to take the perspective of an invisible gifted student. So think about a student that you are particularly interested in. Maybe it's a certain cultural background, maybe it's students from poverty, maybe it's English language learners. Any student that you think would fall under this umbrella term of the invisible gifted. And what you do is write a letter from that student's perspective to the gifted education teacher, or the regular education teacher rather. I've titled this assignment the See Me Statement. So it's basically asking, please see me. I want you to see who I am. I want you to see that I have these gifts and talents, and I want you to challenge me. So if you go into Blackboard, you'll see a couple of different requirements for things that you need to include. So under module assignments, it will show you on the See Me statement. I'm looking for 4 specific things. So a clear description of who you are. So this is not, bullets. This is a letter. I want you to paint a picture of who I am. What's your name? What population are you from? Are you an English language learner? Are you a culturally diverse student? So paint a really clear picture of that. Provide evidence that you are gifted. This doesn't have to be stereotypical front of the room raising your hand evidence. This can be the bad behavior, reading a book under your desk type evidence. Then give me an honest description of some of the challenges that you may face being this traditionally underrepresented student, and then provide some suggestions for how the teachers and the administrators can support you. So, just to be clear, 4 things. Who are you? Provide evidence of your gifts. Give a description about the unique challenges that you face, and then provide some suggestions for how teachers and educators could support you. So hopefully you'll understand that this is meant to be a little creative. I've actually done some research using these CME statements in the past, and they're really powerful. So given all this literature that we've looked into, now's your chance to kind of take it from a more creative license and think about what may it look like to be this invisible student, and what would I want my teacher to know about me. I hope that you guys all have a great week. I apologize for going on a little bit too long. I just think this module is so important, because if we have the correct mindset, that is going to create such a trickle-down positive effect, unlike the incorrect mindset saying there are no gifted students, and how that could trickle down in a very negative manner. As always, I'm here to help. I'm here to answer any questions or receive any comments. If you have any suggestions for improvement or other content you want to make sure we cover, I'd love to hear that as well. One last note, our final module in this class is a special topics module. So that is an opportunity for you to dig deeper into a content related to gifted education that you are really interested in. I've started suggesting a couple of topics for some of you who I'm kind of getting to know and recognize, oh, this individual is very interested in twice exceptional students, or this individual is interested in Native American students. It's really up to you, but I would encourage you to start thinking about what topic would I be interested in digging a little bit deeper into. So just to plant that into your brain for the next couple of weeks. I'm always here, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful week. Thanks.